At first, it seemed unthinkable. The family worship center wasn't just a church, it was a fortress of faith, unity, and generational purpose. Led by the Swaggart legacy, with Donnie Swaggart and his son Gabriel standing front and center, many believe this family was untouchable, bonded by blood and the Bible. But behind the sermons and smiles, subtle cracks began to show. Longtime members started whispering about odd behavior, distant glances, and a growing tension that couldn't be ignored. Something was shifting, not just within the ministry, but within the family itself. And now, what was once sacred is being questioned. Once symbols of unity and legacy, Donnie and Gabriel Swaggart now moved like strangers on familiar ground. Where there were once warm hugs and shared moments of praise, there was now only cold distance. They passed each other like coworkers, not family, exchanging glances that said more than words ever could. Whispers grew louder in the pews and hallways. Did you see that look? Why wasn't Gabriel on stage today? At first, people tried to explain it away. Fatigue, schedule changes, maybe just a bad day. But the truth was unavoidable. Week after week, the tension deepened. Worship leaders were given last-minute cancellations. Donnie would vanish just as Gabriel approached the pulpit. The ministry's rhythm, once seamless, began to falter, and behind forced smiles, staff felt it too. Something sacred was quietly unraveling. And then, the silence shattered. What should have been a routine leadership meeting erupted into something no one was prepared for. Inside the ministry's conference room, surrounded by worship leaders, media heads, and trusted advisors, the unspoken finally found its voice. Donnie walked in, stern and silent, exuding authority. Gabriel followed with optimism and a notebook full of fresh ideas for the church's future. But before a word could be shared, the room turned tense. What happened next would ignite a divide that could no longer be hidden, a confrontation that exposed not just a family disagreement, but a full-blown spiritual power struggle. The storm that had been quietly building inside the Swaggart ministry was no longer coming. It had arrived. In order to reach a new generation, Gabriel enthusiastically presented his ideas, updating the worship experience, bringing in younger voices, and launching a brand new online platform. There were courteous nods at first, but Donnie's face entirely transformed when Gabriel proposed switching up the preaching schedule to give younger pastors a chance. The room fell silent as he crossed his arms, leaned back in his chair, and remarked simply, "That's not how we built this ministry." Nobody anticipated the moment that followed. In front of the staff, Donnie rarely raised his voice. He emphasized to everyone the significance of upholding the church's illustrious name and how long it had carried it. The conversation swiftly turned personal as Gabriel, obviously irritated, emotionally said, "But if we don't grow, we'll lose the next generation." Gabriel didn't feel seen. Donnie felt treated disrespectfully, and before astonished employees, father and son quarreled about the ministry's essence rather than projects or programs. Eventually, Donnie got up and said, "We don't do things like this," and left the conference, leaving Gabriel seated by himself at the table with a vision that now felt burdensome. Whispers were no longer enough. Everyone was now aware of the division. All attention gradually shifted to one individual as the gap between Donnie and Gabriel widened. The matriarch of the Swaggart family, Frances Swaggart, had always been a subdued yet influential figure. Although she rarely discussed family issues in public, her influence within the ministry was widely recognized. She had gracefully and resolutely supported Donnie's leadership and her husband Jimmy's legacy for years. Frances was seen by many as the man who would resolve the conflict between father and son. However, she stayed unusually quiet rather than intervening with outspoken support. But behind the scenes, she started to express dissatisfaction of Gabriel's new course. She wasn't comfortable with the adjustments he suggested. Close staff members muttered. She believed that the church was a hallowed institution that had been established through decades of sacrifice, prayer, and tradition. She didn't like Gabriel's attempts to modernize, bring in new musical genres, and elevate younger voices in leadership. Despite never criticizing him in public, her body language and private talks made it obvious where she stood. She kept showing up next to Donnie on broadcasts. Every time Gabriel's name was spoken, her features were serene but aloof. According to some, she even warned Gabriel in a private conversation to remember his origins. That seemed to Gabriel like a silent rejection of him as much as his ideals. More than anything else, that stung. He had hoped for her approval, perhaps even her backing. However, he was met with a thick silence that reverberated more loudly than words could. Her decision to not step in and protect him widened the gulf. Many in the church believed that Frances had already made up her mind, and as usual, her allegiance remained to the past. The burden of Donnie and Gabriel's feud began to weigh on others around them as it became more apparent. The elders, the staff, the worship team, and even the volunteers. It had always been like a close-knit family at the Family Worship Center. Those who had previously collaborated harmoniously started to feel the strain of picking a side as families were being torn apart from the inside out. A tremendous sense of allegiance to Donnie was felt by several. He had, after all, been there through thick and thin, sustaining the ministry following the demise of Jimmy Swaggart. He was dependable, conventional, and well-known. They supported his methods and were opposed to the church losing its unique character. However, Gabriel caught the attention of others, particularly the younger employees. His enthusiasm, his will to develop, and his conviction that the church must change in order to survive motivated them. They appreciated his ability to engage youth and provide a new perspective to the ministry. They were looking forward to the future for the first time in a long time, but there were dangers associated with being viewed as a Gabriel team. Whispering began. Meetings became heated. Those that stood by Gabriel saw frosty treatment from veteran employees or were excluded from some decisions. The worship team sensed it too. Song selections turned into contests. Schedules were abruptly altered. Others asserted that they were being punished for hanging around with the wrong crowd. It was no longer merely a dispute. The civil war went on in silence. Additionally, Sunday mornings no longer felt like a sacred calling for a large number of employees. It was like having to tread carefully. What was once a haven of solidarity had turned into a battleground of shattered trust and secret alliances. With thousands of people watching at home and in front of the cathedral, the moment everything changed happened live, with the choir singing, the cameras shooting, and Gabriel slated to speak following the worship. It was just another Sunday service. However, Gabriel took a risk and chose to deliver the sermon that was discussed earlier in the week. He put down his notebooks and started talking directly from the heart. Initially composed, his voice was brimming with passion. He talked on how ministries need to expand, how faith needs to transcend physical boundaries, and how holding on to the past too closely can prevent God from working in new ways. The congregation initially listened in quiet, not knowing where he was taking it. However, Gabriel's next statement caused the room to change. It's not always the adversary outside that keeps us back. We refused to question the tradition. It wasn't noisy. It wasn't upset. However, the impact of their comments was felt by everybody. Individuals looked at one another. A few gave a nod. Others scowled. Some employees behind the scenes glanced at Donnie, who was sitting off camera, his face rigid and expressionless. Less than 10 minutes later, Donnie got up and left the church with purpose rather than a big show. The people listening didn't miss it. Everyone could see the tension in real time as it became public. Social media exploded. Viewers wanted to know what was happening. Gabriel was commended by some for his audacity. He was accused of insulting his father by others. Everyone inside the congregation understood that this was more than simply a sermon. It was a declaration. There was no going back now that Gabriel had strayed from the plan. It became evident that action was required following the live broadcast event. Now that the tension was in the open, the leadership was afraid that if it wasn't addressed, it might destroy the ministry. Thus, a private family gathering was set up, only the Swaggart family's core. No cameras, no advisors, no employees. The idea was to get Donnie and Gabriel together in a secure environment so they could talk honestly and work toward recovery. However, the atmosphere was thick from the minute everyone sat down. Frances prayed for harmony and peace as he opened the conference. Even her voice, though, faltered as the two most outspoken men in his legacy sat on opposite ends of the room, unwilling to look at one another. Jimmy sat quietly and watched with sad eyes. Donnie was the first to speak. His statements were caustic, yet he didn't shout or raise his voice. Going off script in front of the world was a betrayal of trust. He warned Gabriel, and his actions were risky. He claimed that discipline, not drama, was the reason the church had survived for so long. Gabriel did not remain quiet. He retaliated in pain rather than disdain. "I'm sick of being treated like a child," he remarked. "I'm sick of being informed that every new concept is incorrect and of having to tread carefully." You don't want a son, you want a shadow. That statement struck a deep chord with Donnie. Voices rose. Despite Francis's attempts to soothe them, neither guy was prepared to compromise. Years of suppressed annoyance spilled forth. It reopened old wounds. There were many accusations concerning control, envy, and who was genuinely attempting to safeguard the ministry and who was attempting to establish their own reputation. Donnie remained silent until Gabriel got up and said, "If you don't believe in my calling, just say it." The conflict could no longer be concealed following the unsuccessful family meeting. Furthermore, anything significant that occurs behind the scenes in today's environment always ends up online. It began subtly. Donnie and Gabrielle stopped tagging each other in posts, which some ministry followers noted. Then the tech-savvy enthusiasts noticed something more significant. They had entirely unfollowed one another. That was enough to start a flurry of conjecture. Screenshots began to circulate within hours. People started to inquire. Did Gabriel get blocked by Donnie? Why do they no longer preach together? Is the family disintegrating? Then followed the cryptic posts, which piqued curiosity without being overt. A staff member shared a verse from the Bible regarding loyalty and treachery, but someone else posted a note about how not everyone at the table is really on your side. Everyone knew what was being hinted at, but no names were spoken. In the comments, supporters began taking sides. Donnie was justified by others as defending the foundation of the ministry. Others supported Gabriel and commended him for his efforts to bring the church into the modern day. Online, the gap widened much more than it did within the church. Theories regarding the true situation surfaced in Facebook Lives, YouTube videos, and even TikToks. People conjectured about leadership positions, wealth, and everything else. Once a symbol of solidarity, the Family Worship Center was now being debated like a reality show. The saddest aspect is that Gabriel and Donnie remained silent. The cacophony was only amplified by their stillness. The online community was refusing to let the controversy that started in the pulpit go away. One person couldn't stand by and watch the family disintegrate in the midst of all the drama. Debbie snarled. She had always been the mediator, having been Donnie's wife and having known Gabriel since he was a young boy. Even during trying times, Debbie's presence in the family had always brought peace. Despite the fact that she wasn't loud or aggressive, like other conflicts, she thought this one could be resolved by prayer, understanding, and compassion. Debbie contacted Donnie and Gabriel behind closed doors. In an attempt to warm their hearts, she spoke to each of them independently. She informed Gabriel that his father still loved him, despite his lack of display, and reminded Donnie that Gabriel was not the enemy. Realizing that talks were insufficient, Debbie organized a more significant event, a location where the three of them could converse, pray, and reconnect without criticism or pressure, away from the church and the commotion. With a hopeful heart, she invited them both, made all the arrangements herself, and reserved a peaceful location outside of Baton Rouge. However, neither man appeared on the day of the retreat. Donnie claimed to have other obligations. Gabrielle didn't answer. That day, Debbie sat by herself, waiting silently while her eyes were watering. She had been motivated by love. However, the pride and hurt between father and son could not be healed by love alone. Debbie sent a brief, heartfelt note on her Facebook page later that night, not identifying individuals, but expressing disappointment that everyone loses when families allow forgiveness to be overshadowed by silence. Her loved ones understood exactly what she meant. She made an attempt. She prayed. However, the walls separating Gabriel and Donnie remained intact and continued to rise. Donnie Swaggart returned to the pulpit shortly after Debbie's unsuccessful attempt to bring about peace. But this time, he had a different type of fire in his heart. People could sense that something was unusual as soon as Donnie stepped up to speak at the Sunday morning service, which was packed as usual. He wasn't the steady, composed person he usually was. He had a powerful voice. He spoke passionately, and there was more than just irritation in his eyes. It was a mixture of conviction and anguish. Donnie didn't preach on salvation or grace that morning. Rather, he discussed loyalty, treachery, and how even people closest to you might abandon you. He recounted a biblical tale about people who revolt not from beyond the gates, but from within the home. Without naming any specific individuals, he continued, "The hardest battles are not with strangers. They're with the ones you once held in your arms, prayed with, trusted with everything, only to find they had another plan all along." The assembly became quiet. A few gazed downward, Others, who knew exactly who he was referring to, nodded slowly. The message was very apparent, even though Donnie never used Gabriel's name. His voice broke with passion as the sermon continued. It was honest, sad, and compelling when he stated, "The enemy doesn't always come through the front door. Sometimes he's raised at your table." The sort of message that, when it was over, left the room quiet. Unsure of what to say, people fled the sanctuary that day. Some experienced heartbreak. Others were perplexed. A couple stood firmly behind Donnie and clapped louder than usual. Everyone knew one thing, though. The Swaggart family's wound was now too profound to conceal. It was more than a dispute. The pulpit had suddenly turned into a site of personal suffering, and it was war in the spirit. No one knows if the atmosphere at Family Worship Center will ever feel the same again. But it feels heavy today, as if something precious has been shaken. Gabriel and Donnie both still serve, but never together. They stroll down different corridors, speak in different tones, and show up on different Sundays. It now seems as though two ministries are housed under one roof, rather than a common mission. Some claim that there has been a tacit understanding, a tenuous truce that has been meticulously kept to conceal the extent of the division from the general public. However, the distance is unavoidable for individuals who work in the ministry. The employees have adapted to this new situation. These days, some people only come when Gabriel leads and Donnie preaches. There is a subtle but genuine split even inside the congregation. In order to avoid upsetting either side, the once cohesive church family now communicates in whispers. The rift is still being worked on behind closed doors. Frances doesn't say anything, probably because she is grieving over the separation between the two men she loves the most, depleted by her unsuccessful attempts to remedy what seems insurmountable. Debbie has distanced herself from the spotlight. Donnie continues to be a pillar for those who think the church should never change, while Gabrielle continues to preach passionately and attract a younger audience. The burden of legacy rests on both men. Although they both think they're doing morally, neither of them appears to be prepared to compromise. The church sits and watches, wondering whether there will ever be healing or if this is just the start of a much larger rift that might permanently alter the Swaggart family and the ministry.